This is the second video about type in CSS, and in this one we're going to talk about changing the font on our page. Now there are some slightly more advanced techniques that we may talk about later, but for now we'll keep it quite generic. Now if we look over here on our page, by default this font has loaded in. It looks a certain way and we may want to change that. And the way in which we do this is by, and we'll do this on the H1 to start with, we use the rule font family, and you'll notice here that this list is quite long. Now by default there are several options which we can put in. Now the first is serif, and this is actually what is loaded in by default, so this is a serif font. Now another one we can put in is sans serif, and this is something like Arial or Helvetica, so you can see here that a lot of these embellishments on the edges of the letters, known as serifs, have disappeared, and that's because this is our sans serif font, which on Mac I believe is Helvetica, and on Windows it's Arial. Now that's great. Font family serif, font family sans serif. There are some others. We can use cursive, and the cursive on Windows is the Comic Sans font, which we have all learned to love, and here it is this font. There are some others again. There's monospace, which is used when we write code. You know, every character here is exactly the same width. So you'll notice, for example, this one here, this apostrophe, is the same width as everything else, which makes it a lot easier when we're writing code. In fact, this is a monospace font here. We can also use fantasy. And fantasy is slightly different on every computer. On this one, I believe this is called Papyrus, but please don't quote me on that. And this is fine, but we're still quite limited in the options that we can provide. So sometimes we may want to be more specific. We may want to say, no, I want you to use this particular font. And the way we do that in quotes is we name the font. So we don't need quotes for the kind of reserved keywords, but we do if we're naming our own font. In fact, if we look at the options here, so font family, the options aren't coming up, fine, but there is a font installed called Menlo, and if I refresh this, this is the font Menlo, which I believe is also the default font here in Visual Studio Code. But what happens if the user doesn't have Menlo installed? Like, we're making a lot of assumptions. We're assuming that whatever they're using will have the font that we're dictating, and that may not always be the case. So we can provide fallbacks. We can say, hey, try and find Menlo on the system, but if you can't, comma, instead, how about you try and use a font called Open Sans, or perhaps if that isn't there, just give me the most appropriate sans serif font and refresh. So now there's Menlo. Now if I make a spelling error, because I don't have a font called Menlo, you'll notice here this has just gone back to the Helvetica example because it can't find Menlo. It can't find Open Sans, which is actually a font. So instead, it will just load sans serif. And this is a way in which we can provide. Oh, actually, it's written perfectly here. Prioritized list of font family names. I'll start with the first one, and if it can't find it, it'll keep going till it finds a match. So it's really important that at the end we put one of the reserved kind of categories. So at least we know it will load something kind of like what we want.